Hi, my name is Shayla with Revolting Science Resources, a company designed to bring the principles of project management to academic scientists. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing how to create a system around routine tasks that you likely have as an academic scientist. So, when I'm talking about a system, I'm talking about some sort of framework or method that you're using to do a routine task. What's worth noting is that developing systems works best when you're talking about a task that you're doing regularly. Although there are specific tasks that I need to do in order to complete a research project about animal behavior, those are not routine tasks. Those instead are likely connected to something like a project plan where I have very specific experiments that I need to complete to address very specific questions. On the other hand, a routine task that does actually support the research that I'm doing would be maintaining a mouse colony. And so something like maintaining a mouse colony works really well for devising a system around because it's something I'm doing very regularly. And so to have a clear idea of how I'm actually going to do that task is really valuable. So, how do you actually create a system? To create a system, the first step is to actually just reflect on the different routine tasks that you have as an academic scientist. Like I mentioned, one that I had while I was in grad school was maintaining my mouse colony. Then, what I would recommend doing is actually focusing on three different questions related to your specific routine task. The first is, what is the goal of the system? The second is, where is the source of truth for the system? And the third is, who owns the system? These questions are really great not only to assess the current systems that you already have in place, but also to create new systems that will work better at helping you make your work more efficient or just building a better system to support the work that you're doing overall. So, now to illustrate these three questions at work, I'm going to give two examples from my time in graduate school. The first example is actually from an individual task that I was primarily responsible for, which was maintaining a mouse colony. So, when I first joined the lab, I inherited mice in our lab's mouse colony that were primarily my responsibility and were intended to be used for my research projects. So, now let's take this routine task and apply those three questions. So, the first is, what is the goal of the system? And so the goal for me for my mouse colony was to be able to have the mice that I needed for my various experiments and know where they were. For the second question, the source of truth for this information was pretty much on the cage cards in the mouse room. So whenever I actually needed to know what mice I had or how many I had or other kind of pieces of information, I pretty much had to go down to the mouse room and write it down or look at all the different cage cards and see what was available for me to use for my experiments. For the third question, I was the person that was primarily responsible for this mouse colony. I did share some of the responsibility with a postdoc in my lab as we shared some of the mouse lines for both of our different experiments. But overall, I was the one that was responsible for maintaining my mouse colony maintenance system. So, this was what my mouse colony maintenance system looked like when I first joined the lab. But roughly halfway through, I was not a fan of this system anymore. Primarily, I hated going down to the mouse room all the time, especially just to check on the availability of specific mice. I also found that it was really difficult whenever I was leaving town or needing undergrads to help me out with some of my mouse colony maintenance to actually know what had been done with my colony and where things stood. Because of these couple of different frustrations that I had, I actually decided to transition my mouse colony maintenance system into a digital format. I actually created a Google Sheet that I used to help maintain and keep track of different mice within my colony. So here's what the answers to those three questions look like after I implemented this new digital system. So for the first question, my goal remained the same. I was still mostly just interested in knowing what mice I had available to use for my various experiments and knowing where I could find them. Now, my source of truth was actually this Google Sheet that I had in a digital format that was easily shared with the various people that were helping me with my mouse colony maintenance, but also available for me to reference without having to go down to the mouse room. And then for the third question, I was still the person who owned the maintenance of my mouse colony. So, although there were still people who were involved in helping me maintain my mouse colony, and although I still shared some of my mice with the postdoc that was in my lab, overall, I was the one that was responsible for making sure that everyone who needed access to the template had access to the template, but also that they knew how to use it and update the information. And then I also made any adjustments that were necessary to the Google Sheet that I had to make sure that the information in there was kept up to date and relevant whenever I would need it. So, taking some time to reflect on what was and what was not working with my mouse colony maintenance system led to me actually transitioning to a digital format that worked much better for me and my research, was much less frustrating because I didn't have to go down to the mouse room every time I wanted to check to see if I had a mouse for an experiment, and was also just overall more efficient and worked better for the kind of collaborative environment that we had in our lab. So I think this is a really great example of how you can implement systems on an individual level. And you don't necessarily need your whole lab to be behind you to be able to create systems that improve your overall efficiency and help you get your lab work done. Before I transition to talking about a system that you can create that works for a lab as a whole, if you also work with mice and want to have some sort of digital format for maintaining your mouse colony, I'd recommend checking out two different templates that I have available in the RSR Resource Library. The first is a mouse colony maintenance template I designed specifically using Google Sheets. So this is somewhat similar to the system that I actually used while I was in graduate school, and it's best used for an individual who's interested in tracking breeding and mouse cages overall, and doesn't work as great when you're interested in tracking individual mice. But I have another mouse colony maintenance template that's also available in the RSR Resource Library that's designed using Notion and includes not only the functionality to keep track of breeding in individual cages, but also individual mice. And it also has the ability to be a bit more collaborative than the Google Sheets version of this template. So if you're interested in either of those and you'd like to make your mouse colony maintenance a bit more digital as well, I'd recommend checking out the two YouTube videos that I have on my channel that actually show some previews of both of those templates. And then you can look in the description box below where I'll put links to actually download these templates from the RSR Resource Library. Okay, so now let's transition to another example of how to create a system that's focused more on the lab as a whole and not necessarily you as an individual. So, as another example from my time in graduate school, our lab actually used this concept that we called Person of the Month. And so, the idea with the Person of the Month system that we used in my lab was every month we would rotate between different lab members and they would be responsible for various tasks that were placed on a whiteboard that we had in the lab. Most of the time, this involved maintenance related tasks or ordering, refilling, or restocking reagents that were communally used, like 1x PBS, among other things. And the goal here was to not make it any one person's responsibility, to allow there to be rotation between different tasks, but to also have a space where when we identified that there was something that was needed for the lab, it also provided a space for various lab members to put that information. There can be a resolution and whatever tasks need to be completed could get done. So, with that little bit of backstory about what the Person of the Month looked like in our specific lab, let's look at those three questions related to creating or assessing a system. So, for the first question, the goal of the system was to make sure that communal reagents and supplies were always available and that communal areas and equipment that were used within the lab were well maintained. Another goal of this system was also to make sure that this work was more evenly distributed among the entire lab and not necessarily one lab member's responsibility. The source of truth for the system actually lived in two different places. So it primarily lived on the whiteboard that we had in our office space in the lab. Whenever new reagents or supplies or maintenance was required for various equipment, it would get added to this whiteboard. And then the Person of the Month would see that and then do the task. In terms of who the Person of the Month was, that source of truth actually lived on a lab calendar that we had. So then for the third question, there was not really someone who was primarily responsible for making sure the task got done or even training people on the tasks, but the lab manager was responsible for making sure new lab members got added to the calendar and basically put into the rotation for being a Person of the Month. So we're going to go maybe partially the lab manager in our lab. So obviously, I've graduated, I've moved on, I don't work in this lab anymore, and the system could look completely the same, could look very different. But if I were going to basically redesign the system, take some time and reflect on what it looked like while I was in graduate school and what it might look like if it were improved upon, I would again take some time and just reflect. And when I did that, I would notice there were a few kind of flaws that existed within the system that we had. The first flaw is that even in trying to answer that last question of who was responsible for this system, it was the lab manager, but not really the lab manager and not for all parts of the system. And so I'd probably make sure that there was someone that was more clearly responsible for this system as a whole. Another issue that would happen occasionally, and especially happened more so right after COVID when not everybody was coming into the lab every day, using a whiteboard was in some ways very convenient and useful. It, though, was really tricky when you weren't physically present to see what tasks had been added to the whiteboard. And we didn't have any sort of system in place to notify the Person of the Month that new items had been added. Additionally, when the person of the month transitioned to a new person, it wasn't clear which tasks would still belong to the person who was previously the person of the month and which would just become the new person of the month's responsibility. So, another thing I might change is actually just making this more of a digital system so that there can be a way to notify people when a new task has been added that they're responsible for completing, but actually assign those tasks to specific people so that as the months transition, even if you didn't finish all the tasks in your month, they don't just get passed to the next person for them to complete the following month. If I, again, were redesigning the system and answering those 3 questions about creating a system, the first question would still have the exact same answer. The goal of the system would be to make sure that communal reagents and supplies were always available and ordered when necessary, and that communal areas and equipment within the lab were organized and well maintained. And that also, this wasn't just one person's sole responsibility, but work that was shared amongst all of the lab members. The source of truth for the system would live in some sort of digital format. So, actually, as part of the RSR Lab Notion template, which is a comprehensive lab management system that I designed within Notion that labs can use to help keep all the various information related to running a lab in one place. I actually designed a system that was able to handle this concept of a person of the month. In the design of this Notion system, I actually addressed the 2 issues that I had with the way the system was handled previously. Obviously, it's in a digital format, but you're able to actually assign the task to specific people. So even as the months transition, you know who's responsible for each task on the list. And it also will notify lab members when a task has been assigned to them. It also serves as the point of truth for who the person of the month is and also which tasks were assigned to which person of the month. And then for the last question, I would make the lab manager in my lab, if I had one, the person that was primarily responsible for being in charge of this system. In this scenario, that would likely mean that the lab manager was responsible for making sure that the person of the month actually completed the tasks that were assigned to them. They also would make sure that new lab members had a sense of how the system worked and were trained on how to do specific tasks that would likely show up on this list. And they would likely be responsible for making any adjustments or changes to the system as necessary based on the feedback that they received from various lab members. So that's just an example of what creating a system could look like for more of a group as opposed to individual tasks that you might have. So before I wrap up, just thinking again about that second question of where does the source of truth live for various information in your lab? Take a second, and if you're having trouble answering that question for information within your lab, I would highly recommend checking out the RSR Lab Notion template. Again, essentially, it serves as your source of truth for all of the different areas that your lab touches, from research to protocols to reagents and supplies. It stores all of that information in one place so you know exactly where to find it. If you'd like to learn more about the RSR Lab Notion template, there's a series of videos that's available on my channel where I walk through some of the different components that make up this template. And I'll also put a link in the description box below that'll take you to a page on my website where you can learn more information about this template and how to sign up to get one for your lab. So overall, I hope this video illustrated the power of identifying and reflecting on the various routine tasks that you have as an academic scientist, and then creating systems that can help make those tasks more efficient or at the very least better defined. Just as a quick summary, again, whenever you're creating a system or assessing a system that you already have, just ask yourself these 3 questions. What is the goal of the system? Where is the source of truth for the system? And who owns the system? By focusing on these 3 questions, you're able to create systems that are better defined and better able to support the routine tasks that you need to do as an academic scientist. So I'd love to hear in the comment section below. What are some routine tasks that you have to do as a scientist that you'd like to develop some systems around? Also, don't forget to check out the description box below to get links to the Notion and Google Sheets version of the mouse colony maintenance template that's available in the RSR Resource Library, and also to learn more about the RSR Lab Notion template and how you can create a source of truth for all the information in your lab. That's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.